Act 1. The Weight of a Pen. The Mont Blanc pen felt like a loaded gun between Victoria Hartwell's fingers. Outside the 53rd floor of One World Trade Center, a violent July thunderstorm was tearing apart the Manhattan skyline. Lightning split the darkness above the Hudson in white, surgical flashes. Rain hammered the floor-to-ceiling glass with the specific, relentless fury of something personal, as though the city itself had turned its back on her tonight, withdrawing the skyline she had spent 14 years earning the right to look down upon. Hartwell Atlantic Shipping had once been worth $4.6 billion. Tonight, it was worth exactly the paper stacked in front of her. The Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing sat on the custom-built rosewood conference table. 320 pages of meticulous corporate obituary, annotated in red ink by the senior restructuring partners at Weil, Gottschall, and Manges, the white shoe firm she had retained 6 months ago when the hemorrhaging began and she still believed it could be stopped. The documents were immaculate, comprehensive. They smelled faintly of expensive toner and finality, and they represented the complete and total destruction of everything her grandfather, Captain James Hartwell, had built across 60 years of brutal, honest work. Victoria was 37 years old. She had the kind of composed, angular beauty that the financial press loved to photograph. High cheekbones, ice blue eyes that processed information faster than most people formed opinions. Dark auburn hair she wore pulled back in the severe, unadorned style of a woman who had decided long ago that softness was a liability in rooms like this one. She had graduated first in her class from Wharton's MBA program at 22, turned down a managing director track at Morgan Stanley to take over her grandfather's struggling mid-Atlantic fleet, and spent 15 years transforming it into the second largest privately held logistics conglomerate on the eastern seaboard. The Wall Street Journal had called her relentlessly disciplined. Forbes had called her the most dangerous woman in American shipping. Her 44,000 employees, from the crane operators in the Port of Baltimore to the logistics coordinators in the Houston hub to the dispatch managers in the Seattle terminal, simply called her Ms. Hartwell. And they meant it as the highest possible form of respect. None of that was going to matter after 7 a.m. For the past 9 months, Hartwell Atlantic had been bleeding capital in a manner that defied every internal model and every external audit. It had started as an inexplicable trickle, a fuel cost variance here, a missed revenue projection there, anomalies small enough to be attributed to the natural volatility of global shipping markets. But the trickle had become a torrent, and the torrent had become a catastrophe, and now Victoria Hartwell sat before a $1.4 billion phantom deficit, with her credit lines at J.P. Morgan Chase and Bank of America frozen solid, and her attorneys telling her with the polished detachment of men who billed $2,100 an hour that surrender was the only rational option. 44,000 people were about to lose their jobs, their health insurance, and their pension contributions because she had failed to see it coming. Victoria. The voice belonged to Franklin Marsh, her chief financial officer. Franklin was 63, silver-haired, and possessed of the kind of measured patrician credibility that came from 4 decades of navigating the jagged terrain of corporate finance. He had been her grandfather's most trusted financial advisor, the man who had talked James Hartwell through the 2008 financial crisis, who had structured the debt refinancing that had saved the company in 2011, who had held Victoria's hand through her first terrifying year as CEO, and whispered, "You are ready," when she most needed to hear it. He stood beside her now with his hand resting on her shoulder, warm and paternal and practiced. "I know how devastating this moment is," Franklin said, his voice carrying the precise calibration of genuine empathy. "But we have exhausted every legitimate avenue available to us. The transatlantic freight rate collapse, the spike in Brent crude, the port congestion penalties from the Long Beach backlog. It was a convergence of catastrophic market forces that no one could have predicted or prevented. No one is assigning blame here. But if you do not sign before the market opens at 9:30, the senior creditors will petition for conversion to Chapter 7. We won't restructure, Victoria. We will be liquidated. 60 years of your family's work sold at auction for pennies. James Whitfield, the lead restructuring attorney from Weil, Gotschall, checked his Vacheron Constantin watch with the barely concealed impatience of a man whose morning was running behind schedule. He was impeccably dressed, entirely bloodless, and had almost certainly never lost sleep over a client's emotional state. Mr. Marsh is correct, Miss Hartwell. The grace period under the forbearance agreement expires in 47 minutes. The Honorable Patricia Chen in the Southern District is waiting on our electronic submission. Every minute of delay materially increases your personal exposure for breach of fiduciary duty to the board and creditors. We need your signature now. Victoria closed her eyes. She thought of Raymond Kowalski, a third-generation crane operator at the Dundalk Marine Terminal in Baltimore, who had sent her a handwritten letter last Christmas, thanking her for the company's health insurance that had covered his wife's chemotherapy. She thought of Denise Morales in Houston, a single mother of 3 who had worked her way from data entry to regional logistics director over 12 years. She thought of the 200 dock workers in Savannah who had voted down a competing union offer because they trusted Hartwell Atlantic to take care of them, all of them, blindsided, because she had failed. "How does it happen, Franklin?" she asked, and her voice was barely above a whisper, scraped raw by 72 hours without sleep and the specific, corrosive grief of watching something irreplaceable die. "We had clean audits. KPMG gave us an unqualified opinion 2 quarters ago. How does $1.4 billion in operational capital simply cease to exist?" Franklin sighed, a long measured exhale that communicated the exhaustion of a man who had asked himself the same question 1,000 times. The subsidiary architecture in the Gulf Coast Division and the Caribbean routes was too fragmented, Victoria. Localized P and L manipulation to hit quarterly targets, hiding losses inside intercompany transfers. By the time the damage consolidated into the master ledger, it was systemic and terminal. It is a structural failure, tragic and unprecedented, but ultimately beyond anyone's control. She looked at him. Something in the delivery, too smooth, too comprehensive, too rehearsed, snagged briefly on the frayed edge of her exhausted awareness. A fleeting tightness around his eyes, a microsecond of something that was not quite grief and not quite patience. But her mind was running on fumes and adrenaline, and the thought dissolved before she could hold it. The math didn't lie. The accounts were empty. The creditors were circling. Victoria Hartwell reached for the pen. She uncapped it slowly. The gold nib caught the light from the storm-dimmed windows. She stared at the small black line at the bottom of page 318, the one that read Chief Executive Officer, and she understood with a hollow, nauseating clarity that the moment her pen touched that line, she would cease to be the person her grandfather had believed she could become. She hovered the pen over the paper. The boardroom was absolutely silent, save for the deep, rhythmic thrum of the building's climate control system, the drumming of rain against 53 floors of glass, and the almost imperceptible sound of a plastic trash liner being cinched in the far corner of the room. Marcus Webb had been invisible for so long that he had almost forgotten it wasn't permanent. At 43, Marcus wore the dark navy uniform of Summit Facility Solutions, a third-party commercial cleaning contractor that serviced the upper floors of One World Trade from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. His equipment was unremarkable. A telescoping window squeegee, a cart with a squeaky front left wheel he had learned to compensate for, a utility belt carrying microfiber cloths, and a pH-neutral glass cleaner that smelled faintly of artificial lemon. His employee ID badge showed a man who existed within this building primarily as a function, someone who made the glass towers of the powerful gleam and disappeared before anyone of consequence arrived. He had not always been invisible. 6 years ago, Marcus Webb had been a senior forensic accountant and financial risk analyst in the disputes and investigations practice at Deloitte's New York office. He had worn a suit every day. He had carried a calfskin briefcase his late mother had given him when he passed the CPA exam. He had a brownstone in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, a daughter named Clara who was 7 years old and obsessed with dinosaurs, and a wife named Diane who taught 4th grade at PS 38 and made Sunday morning pancakes that were, by any objective measure, the best pancakes in the borough. Then his daughter got sick. Clara was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma at age 8, a rare and aggressive bone cancer that required immediate, intensive, and extraordinarily expensive treatment at Memorial Sloan Kettering. The American healthcare system, with its Baroque architecture of deductibles, prior authorization denials, out-of-network penalties, and coverage exclusions for experimental protocols, had methodically dismantled Marcus Webb's carefully constructed life with the indifferent efficiency of a machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. He had taken FMLA leave to be with Clara during her induction chemotherapy. Deloitte had been understanding for a while. Then came the restructuring. His position was eliminated in a reduction in force that had nothing to do with his performance and everything to do with the calendar. He had been quietly, professionally, thoroughly let go. The medical bills had consumed his savings in 4 months, his 401k in 6, the brownstone in 11. Diane had stayed, through the bankruptcy filing, through the move to a 2-bedroom rental in Flatbush, through the debt consolidation and the credit collapse and the grinding indignity of applying for Medicaid. She had stayed because she was the strongest person Marcus had ever known, and because Clara needed both of them, and because love, real love, the kind forged in catastrophe, does not have an exit clause. Clara was in remission now. 14 months of clean scans. She was 10 years old, back in school, currently in a passionate and consuming phase of interest in the Cretaceous period, and she was alive. But the debt was still there, $680,000 in residual medical obligations, the stripped-down remainder after insurance settlements and charity care applications. And Marcus needed health insurance. Clara's maintenance monitoring and semi-annual imaging were non-negotiable, and he needed hours that allowed him to take her to her quarterly oncology follow-ups at Sloan Kettering during the day. So he cleaned glass towers at night. Tonight, the Hartwell Atlantic Executive Suite had been a wreckage. The senior leadership team had been here since the previous morning. Catered meals congealing in their containers, legal pads covered in increasingly desperate notes, recycling bins overflowing with the paper refuse of a company fighting for its life. Marcus had clocked in at 10 p.m. His supervisor had been explicit. The boardroom had to be immaculate before the 7 a.m. filing meeting, or Marcus would lose the shift differential that made the difference between covering Clara's next copay and not. At 6:18 a.m., while drawing his squeegee across the massive smart glass projection wall in long overlapping strokes, Marcus stopped. The executives had left the company's master financial ledger projected on the glass. A sprawling, luminous lattice of spreadsheets detailing Hartwell Atlantic's operational expenses for the prior fiscal year. To the security guard who had waved Marcus in. To the receptionist who had handed him his cart. To every person in this building who wore a badge above a certain pay grade, it was simply background data. Wallpaper. To Marcus Webb's forensic accounting brain, the part of him that had spent 15 years finding the one number that didn't belong. It was a language, and something in it was badly, badly wrong. He leaned his squeegee against the wall. He pulled the small spiral notebook from his breast pocket, the one he used to track Clara's medication schedule and appointment dates, and clicked his pen. His eyes had locked onto a column heading in the lower left quadrant of the projection. Gulf Coast and Caribbean Division. Fleet operating expenses, bunker fuel surcharges, and the numbers beneath it made absolutely no sense at all. Act 2, the language of numbers. Marcus had not intended to look. That was the thing he would return to later, in the quiet hours after everything had changed. The fact that it had started as nothing more than occupational habit. The same involuntary pattern recognition that had made him exceptional at Deloitte. The same neural wiring that had once allowed him to find a $340,000 discrepancy buried inside 4,000 pages of intercompany transfer documentation for a Fortune 100 insurance client. His eyes had simply done what 15 years of forensic training had conditioned them to do. They found the thing that didn't belong. The ledger's Gulf Coast and Caribbean Division fuel column reported bunker surcharges for a fleet of 24 Handymax-class cargo vessels operating out of the port of New Orleans and Nassau, Bahamas. The combined fuel expenditure across 3 fiscal quarters was listed at $431 million, a figure so staggering it represented nearly 31% of the company's total reported deficit. Taken in isolation against the backdrop of historically elevated marine diesel prices and the post-pandemic freight rate volatility, it was aggressive but not impossible. Except Marcus's eyes slid to the adjacent column. Vessel maintenance and regulatory status, current period. He pulled his pen across the notebook page. Vessel 214. Fuel expenditure $9.1 million across Q2 and Q3. Stated consumption, maximum operational capacity, deep water routing, Gulf of Mexico to Rotterdam. Maintenance status, dry docked, Pascagoula, Mississippi. Full keel and hull reconstruction. Operational suspension commenced April 3rd. Estimated return to service, November. Marcus wrote the number down and stared at it. A ship sitting on dry dock blocks in Pascagoula, Mississippi, with its hull stripped to bare steel and its engines offline, does not consume $9.1 million in bunker fuel. It does not consume any bunker fuel. It does not move. It does not exist, operationally, in any form that costs a single dollar in marine diesel. He kept reading. Vessel 219. Fuel expenditure, $8.4 million, Q2 through Q4. Maintenance status, dry docked, Port Arthur, Texas. Propeller shaft replacement and Coast Guard compliance refit, 0 sea days logged for the entire fiscal period. Vessel 203. Fuel expenditure, $11.2 million, the largest single vessel charge in the entire column. Regulatory status, federal impound hold, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Port of Miami. Vessel under active inspection. Prohibited from departure. Marcus stopped writing. He counted 16 of the 24 vessels generating catastrophic fuel expenditures had been either dry docked for major maintenance, impounded by federal regulators, or listed under emergency repair holds for the majority of the fiscal year. Collectively, they had logged fewer than 90 operational sea days between them across 3 quarters. Yet they had been billed, and the bills had been paid, for $431 million in fuel consumption at maximum deep water operational rates. The arithmetic was not complex. The fraud was not subtle. It was, in fact, so straightforward that Marcus understood immediately why it had worked. Because no one who had the authority to approve these payments had ever looked at both columns at the same time. The fuel expenses lived in the operational finance division. The dry dock logs lived in the fleet management division. 2 separate departments, 2 separate reporting chains, 2 separate sets of eyes, and somewhere between them, someone had built a wall. Marcus turned to the vendor routing section of the ledger. Every payment, all $431 million across 16 months, had been authorized and dispersed to a single vendor entity. Gulf South Maritime Supply, LLC. He opened his phone. The Florida Division of Corporations database returned a result in under a minute. Gulf South Maritime Supply, LLC. Registered agent address. A mail forwarding service on Brickell Avenue in Miami. Date of incorporation 18 months ago. Managing member. A holding company called Pelican Bay Trade Partners, registered in the British Virgin Islands. No physical office, no documented employees, no history of commercial transactions with any fuel supplier in the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean basin. Not a fuel company. A ghost. Marcus stood completely still in the corner of the empty boardroom, his notebook in one hand and his phone in the other, the smart glass projection casting pale blue light across his navy uniform. His mouth had gone dry. The squeegee leaned against the wall where he had left it. The lemon-scented glass cleaner sat untouched in its holster. He understood, with the absolute cold clarity of a man who had spent his career inside the architecture of financial crime, exactly what he was looking at. This was not a market failure. This was not supply chain fragmentation or subsidiary mismanagement or the unpredictable convergence of macroeconomic headwinds. This was a theft, methodical, sustained, and staggering in its scale. Someone inside Hartwell Atlantic, someone with the organizational authority to create vendor relationships, approve 8-figure disbursements, and control the internal audit processes designed to catch exactly this, had been systematically draining the company for over a year. And in 41 minutes, Victoria Hartwell was going to sign her family's empire away because she believed the deficit was real. Marcus looked at the clock mounted above the boardroom door. 6:19 a.m. He could already hear the elevator banks on the other side of the oak double doors beginning to cycle. The low mechanical hum of a building waking up, executives arriving, the day beginning its irreversible motion. If he was found here, analyzing proprietary financial data on his phone, the consequences would not merely be termination. A cleaning contractor accessing confidential corporate ledgers could be prosecuted under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. He would lose the job. He would lose the insurance. Clara's next imaging appointment was in 3 weeks. Not your problem, he told himself. His voice was barely a breath. These people have lawyers, they have investigators, they have the FBI. They don't need you. He capped his pen. He slid the notebook back into his breast pocket. He picked up the squeegee and turned toward his cart with the deliberate, practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to make himself disappear. He was 4 steps from the service exit when the oak double doors swung open. Victoria Hartwell walked in. She looked like a woman who had been through a sustained siege and was determined not to show it. Her posture was impeccable, the product of 15 years of boardrooms where any visible weakness was immediately cataloged and used. Her charcoal Loro Piana suit was unwrinkled despite the fact that she had almost certainly slept in her office, if she had slept at all. Her auburn hair was pulled back without a strand out of place. But her eyes, Marcus had seen that specific quality of exhaustion before. He had seen it in the mirror the morning after the oncologist at Sloan Kettering had explained, with careful clinical precision, what Clara's diagnosis meant and what the treatment protocol would cost. It was the look of someone who had already done the math and understood that the numbers did not work out in their favor. Behind Victoria came Franklin Marsh, silver-haired, composed, his Brioni suit immaculate, and 2 attorneys from Weil, Gottschall in identical pinstripes, and 2 junior associates carrying document cases, and the building's head of corporate security, and a court liaison from the Southern District. The room filled in seconds. Marcus pressed himself into the alcove behind the recycling station, angling his cart to block his profile, and became furniture. He was exceptionally good at this. For 19 minutes, he stood without moving while the most consequential business decision he had ever witnessed in his life played out 4 feet away from him. He heard Franklin Marsh deliver his polished, comprehensive explanation of systemic failure and market forces. He heard the attorney Whitfield itemize Victoria's personal legal exposure with the detached efficiency of someone reading a grocery list. He heard the court liaison confirm that Judge Chen was waiting. And he heard Victoria Hartwell ask, in a voice so stripped of its usual authority that it barely sounded like the same person, how $1.4 billion could simply vanish from a company with clean audits and a competent financial team. I know exactly how, Marcus thought. His hands had found the edge of the recycling bin. He was gripping it hard enough to feel the plastic flex. I know the vendor name, the registration date, the BVI holding company, and the name of every vessel that was billed for fuel it never burned. I have it written down in a notebook that's currently sitting in my breast pocket between a pen and a reminder that Clara has blood work on the 14th. He watched Victoria uncap the pen. He watched the gold nib descend toward page 318. He thought about the morning the hospital billing coordinator had slid a payment demand across a desk at him. $340,000 due within 90 days. And the specific physical sensation of the floor dropping away beneath him. He had seen his own face in that moment, hollow, terrified, convinced that the math had already decided everything. He was looking at that face right now. It was wearing a $4,000 suit and sitting at the head of a rosewood table on the 53rd floor of One World Trade Center, but it was the same face. The same absolute conviction that there was no other choice. Marcus Webb opened his mouth. "Wait!" The word fell into the boardroom like a stone dropped into still water. James Whitfield, the vile, gaucho attorney, turned toward the recycling alcove with an expression of pure, uncomprehending bewilderment, as though the credenza had spoken. Franklin Marsh's body went rigid in a single involuntary contraction. Victoria Hartwell's hand stopped. The gold nib hovered a millimeter above the signature line. She turned slowly. Her ice-blue eyes found Marcus in the corner. The navy uniform, the squeaky-wheeled cart, the spiral notebook visible in his breast pocket. And she looked at him for exactly 3 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "Who are you?" Not dismissively. Not with the reflexive condescension that Marcus had learned to expect from people on the upper floors when the cleaning staff briefly interrupted their field of vision. She asked it the way a person asks a question when they genuinely need the answer. Marcus stepped out of the alcove. He was aware of how he looked. He was aware of the bleach stain on his left sleeve and the scuff marks on his steel-toed boots, and the fact that his spiral notebook had a sticker on the cover that Clara had put there, a cartoon triceratops, slightly crooked, because she had insisted and he had not had the heart to remove it. He stood up straight. "My name is Marcus Webb. I'm with Summit Facility Solutions." He paused. "Before that, I was a senior forensic accountant in Deloitte's disputes and investigations practice. I spent 15 years finding fraud inside maritime logistics companies." Franklin Marsh recovered first. His laugh was short and precise, the social equivalent of a scalpel. "A janitor with a forensic accounting background. Victoria, the judge is waiting. This man has no standing to be in this proceeding, and quite possibly no legal right to have viewed your financial data. James, please call security." "Stop!" Victoria's voice was not raised. It did not need to be. It carried the specific, undeniable authority of someone who had spent 15 years making decisions that moved ships across oceans. Whitfield's hand froze over his phone. Marsh went still. Victoria looked at Marcus. Past the uniform, past the cart, directly at him. "You have 60 seconds, Mr. Webb," she said. "What number did I miss?" "So, Act 3, the convergence point." Marcus walked past Franklin Marsh without looking at him. He picked up the dry erase marker from the ledge beneath the smart glass wall, tapped the touch panel to wake the projection, and pulled up the master ledger with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man returning to work he had never truly left. The financial architecture glowed across 12 feet of glass in crisp, luminous columns, and Marcus circled the heading in the upper left quadrant with a single, deliberate stroke. Gulf Coast and Caribbean Division, Fleet Operating Expenses, Bunker Fuel Surcharges. "Your CFO told you this deficit was caused by market forces," Marcus said, and his voice had settled into a register he had not used in 6 years, the measured, precise cadence of a Deloitte senior manager presenting findings to a board of directors. Brent crude volatility, transatlantic freight rate compression, subsidiary mismanagement in the Gulf Division. He gave you a complete, coherent, internally consistent explanation. He drew a hard red line across the glass. "It is also entirely false." "This is defamation," Marsh said, his voice sharp and immediate. "Victoria, I have spent 40 years— 40 seconds, Mr. Webb," Victoria said, without looking away from the glass. Marcus pointed to the fuel column. 24 Handy Max vessels, Gulf Coast and Caribbean routes. 3/4 of fuel expenditures at maximum operational capacity, deep water routing, full burn rates, the highest possible consumption tier. Total disbursement, $431 million, paid to a single vendor. He navigated to the maintenance manifest and drew a second red line, connecting Vessel 214's fuel charge directly to its regulatory status entry. The line looked like a wound across the glass. Vessel 214, $9.1 million in fuel for Q2 and Q3. Maintenance status, dry docked in Pascagoula, Mississippi, for full hull reconstruction. Operational suspension began April 3rd. The vessel did not move. It did not burn fuel. It did not exist as an operating ship for the entirety of the period for which it was billed at maximum consumption rates. The room was absolutely silent. Marcus did not stop. Vessel 219, $8.4 million. Dry docked in Port Arthur, Texas, for propeller shaft replacement. 0 sea days. Vessel 203, the largest single charge in this column at $11.2 million, under active federal impound by U.S. Customs and Border Protection in Miami. Prohibited from departure, prohibited from operation, billed anyway. He stepped back and looked at the wall. 16 red lines connected 16 stationary ships to 16 fraudulent fuel charges spread across the glass like the map of a deliberate, sustained, and extraordinarily patient crime. 16 vessels, collectively fewer than 90 operational sea days across 3 quarters, billed for $431 million in fuel at maximum deep water burn rates. Marcus turned to face the room. And every single payment, every dollar of that $431 million, was authorized and dispersed to one vendor. He pulled up the routing section and circled the vendor name, Gulf South Maritime Supply, LLC. I looked them up while I was emptying your recycling bins, Marcus said. Florida Corporate Registry. Registered agent is a mail forwarding service on Brickell Avenue in Miami. Incorporated 18 months ago, exactly when your cash flow anomalies began. Managing member is a British Virgin Islands holding company called Pelican Bay Trade Partners. No physical office, no employees on record, no documented history of commercial fuel transactions anywhere in the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean basin. He set the marker down on the ledge. That is not a fuel supplier. That is a ghost company. And someone inside this organization, someone with the authority to create vendor relationships, approve 8-figure disbursements, and control the audit processes designed to catch exactly this, has been feeding your company's capital into it for a year and a half. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silence before. The earlier silence had been the silence of a room waiting for something to end. This was the silence of a room in which something had just irrevocably changed. Victoria Hartwell stood up. She did not move quickly. She moved with the slow, inevitable deliberateness of a woman who had learned that the most important moments in a room required stillness, not speed. She walked to the smart glass wall and stood before the 16 red lines, her fingertip tracing the connection between Vessel 203's $11.2 million fuel charge and its federal impound status. She followed it twice. Then she studied the vendor routing column in silence for 11 seconds. The math was not complex. That was the thing that would stay with her. The elegant, terrible simplicity of it. The fuel expenses and the maintenance logs had lived in separate departmental silos, reviewed by separate teams, consolidated by a CFO who controlled both reporting chains. Anyone looking at only one column saw a plausible, if aggressive, operational cost. Anyone looking at both columns saw a crime. Someone had spent 18 months making sure no one looked at both columns at the same time. Victoria turned. Franklin Marsh was standing with both hands gripping the edge of the rosewood table. His knuckles were white. His silver hair, which had looked distinguished and authoritative 12 minutes ago, now looked like a costume. The careful, measured composure of 40 years in corporate finance was dissolving in real time, replaced by something rawer and more honest. The specific cornered terror of a man who has just watched the exit close. Franklin, Victoria said, one word. His first name. spoken in a register so quiet and so absolutely final that James Whitfield, the vile, gauchel attorney, took an involuntary step backward. "What is Gulf South Maritime Supply, LLC?" Marsh opened his mouth. It's a regional fuel routing subsidiary, a procurement intermediary. The BVI structure is standard tax optimization architecture, completely legitimate. The discrepancy in the maintenance logs is almost certainly a data migration error from the Q2 system update. The IT team has been a $431 million data migration error, Marcus said quietly, affecting 16 vessels across 3 consecutive quarters. "James," Victoria said, turning to the attorney, "call the FBI, Financial Crimes Unit, New York Field Office. Then call Judge Chen's clerk and withdraw the filing." Whitfield was already reaching for his phone. "Victoria, wait." Marsh stepped forward, his hands raised, his voice dropping into the urgent, intimate register of a man attempting to reclaim a private conversation in a public room. "There are aspects of this that require context. Let me explain in private. Give me 20 minutes and I can—" "Franklin." He stopped. "If you take one more step in my direction," Victoria said, "I will have you removed from this building by security before the FBI arrives. And I will make certain that every financial institution, regulatory body, and industry contact in your professional network knows precisely why." 2 members of the building's corporate security team were in the room within 4 minutes, responding to Whitfield's desk call. As they escorted Franklin Marsh, who had stopped talking and started simply staring at the middle distance with the blank, recalibrating expression of a man whose entire constructed reality had just collapsed. Toward the service elevator, Victoria Hartwell stood at the head of the rosewood table and allowed herself exactly 1 full breath of stillness. Then she turned to Marcus Webb. He was standing beside his card in the corner, the dry erase marker still in his hand, the Triceratops sticker on his notebook catching the morning light from the storm-dimmed windows. He looked, she thought, like a man who had just sprinted 100 yards and was only now beginning to feel it in his legs. "Mr. Webb," she said, walking toward him, "why are you cleaning buildings at night?" He looked at his boots. The adrenaline was fading, and beneath it was the familiar, specific weight of his actual life pressing back into place. "My daughter Clara had Ewing sarcoma. I took leave when she started treatment, and my firm restructured me out. The medical debt took the savings, then the 401k, then the house. This job has health insurance, and the hours let me take her to her follow-up appointments during the day." "Is she in remission?" 14 months of clean scans. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "How much is outstanding?" Marcus looked up. "Ms. Hartwell, but the medical debt, how much?" He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. $680,000. After insurance settlements and every assistance program I could qualify for. Victoria walked to the rosewood table. She opened her leather portfolio, removed a slim black checkbook, and wrote with the same aggressive, precise stroke she used to sign acquisition documents. She tore the check free and held it out. Marcus took it. He read the number. He read it again. His breath left him in a slow, involuntary exhale. "Ms. Hartwell, I can't—" I pointed out a spreadsheet. "I'm not, That is a signing bonus," Victoria said. "Not a gesture. You possess a forensic analytical capability that my $6 million a year accounting firm failed to deploy for 18 months. I don't need a cleaning contractor. I need a chief risk officer who understands from the inside exactly how someone hides $400 million inside an operational ledger." She pointed at the smart glass wall where the 16 red lines still glowed against the blue light of the projection. Franklin Marsh did not build this alone. A fraud of this scale, ghost vendors, BVI holding structures, forged maintenance logs, compromised audit chains, requires resources and infrastructure that a CFO does not possess independently. Someone with significant capital and organizational reach helped him build it. Someone who stood to benefit enormously from Hartwell Atlantic's liquidation. She looked at Marcus directly. "I want to know who." and I want you to find them." Marcus looked at the check, then at the wall, then at the notebook in his breast pocket with Clara's Triceratops sticker on the cover and her appointment dates written in his careful, precise hand. The forensic accountant who had been dormant inside him for 6 years, buried under medical bills and overnight shifts and the grinding, patient work of keeping his daughter alive, stirred with the specific, focused hunger of a mind encountering a problem that was genuinely worthy of it. He folded the check and placed it in his breast pocket beside the notebook. "When do I start?" "Right now," Victoria said. "Leave the ledger up."
Mom.
The next 72 hours transformed the 53rd floor of One World Trade Center into something between a federal evidence room and a financial war room. Victoria commandeered the entire floor. Marcus was given a corner office with a view of the Hudson, 3 forensic workstations with full mainframe access, a direct line to outside counsel at Skadden, ARPS, and a standing order for black coffee that the executive assistant fulfilled with the seriousness of a military logistics operation. Marcus did not sleep. He bypassed the sanitized internal audit trails entirely and went directly to the swift interbank transaction architecture. The raw transfer codes that lived beneath the cleaned-up accounting reports, ugly and technical and extraordinarily revealing to someone who knew how to read them. He traced the $431 million from Gulf South Maritime Supply, LLC, through its first dispersal layer, 19 wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Belize, and the Isle of Man, and then into the elaborate, deliberately disorienting architecture of a professional money laundering operation. The technique was sophisticated. The funds were fractalized into hundreds of sub-transfers ranging between $6,000 and $47,000, calibrated specifically to remain beneath FinCEN's automated suspicious activity report thresholds. They were bounced through shell entities in Panama, Malta, Guernsey, and Macau, with the deliberate complexity of someone who had paid significant money for the design. It was built to defeat algorithmic detection. Marcus wasn't an algorithm. He was looking for human behavior, the one thing that sophisticated financial criminals consistently underestimated. Because money, no matter how expertly scattered, always reflected the psychology of the person moving it. It went to places they trusted. It paid for things they wanted. It converged, eventually, on something personal. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, with a bruised copper sunset settling over the Hudson and his 4th cup of cold coffee sitting untouched beside his keyboard, Marcus found it. He walked into Victoria's office without knocking. She was on the phone with the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, her 3rd call of the day, her voice carrying the controlled, precise tension of someone managing an active federal investigation while simultaneously preventing a public market collapse. She held up one finger, finished the call, and set the phone down. She looked at his face. "Tell me you have something," she said. "The board called an emergency session for tomorrow morning. The press got the withdrawn bankruptcy story 2 hours ago. Our stock is down 19% and 3 board members are threatening a no-confidence motion." Marcus set the dossier on her desk. It was 44 pages. Annotated transaction logs, corporate registry documents from 6 jurisdictions, swift routing analyses, and a 12-page summary that laid out the complete architecture of the fraud in language that a federal grand jury could follow. "The money consolidated," Marcus said, pulling his chair forward. 73% of the dispersed funds were eventually aggregated into a private wealth management account at a UBS subsidiary in Geneva. I cross-referenced the account's outbound dividend routing against registered holding companies in Delaware and Nevada. He reached across the desk and placed his finger on the final page. On a single line, highlighted in yellow, Coastal Dominion Holdings, LLC, sole beneficial owner, Edward Voss. Victoria's face went completely still. Edward Voss was 67 years old. He was the founder and controlling shareholder of Voss Maritime Group, the oldest and most powerful privately held shipping conglomerate on the eastern seaboard, and Hartwell Atlantic's most aggressive and most dangerous competitor for North Atlantic freight contracts. He was old American money and older American grudges, a man who had spent 2 decades making increasingly aggressive acquisition offers for Hartwell Atlantic and growing demonstrably, publicly furious each time Victoria refused him. He had told a Bloomberg interviewer 18 months ago, Marcus noted, the same month Gulf South Maritime Supply LLC was incorporated, that Hartwell Atlantic was a legacy asset being mismanaged by someone more interested in her grandfather's reputation than in the realities of the modern freight market. Victoria had responded by undercutting Voss Maritime's premier North Atlantic contract rates and absorbing 2 of their anchor clients within 90 days. This wasn't a financial crisis, Victoria said very quietly. The words came out slowly, as though she was hearing them for the first time as she spoke them. It was an acquisition strategy. He was manufacturing the conditions for a forced sale. He funded the ghost vendor infrastructure and bribed Marsh to operate it, Marcus confirmed. The design was precise. Drain Hartwell Atlantic's liquid capital over 18 months, manufacture an unserviceable deficit, force a Chapter 11 filing, and position Voss Maritime to acquire your entire North Atlantic fleet and terminal network at liquidation auction. Marsh receives a $60 million position in the Cayman account. Voss absorbs your grandfather's company for 30 cents on the dollar. Victoria stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the Hudson. The last copper light of the day breaking apart on the water, the Jersey Shore darkening across the river. She had been brought to the absolute edge of destruction by the 2 men she had trusted most in her professional life, orchestrated by a competitor who had decided that if he could not buy her company, he would simply take it. She stood at the window for a long time. When she turned back, the grief was gone. What remained was something colder and more purposeful. Can we prove it in federal court? The digital trail is comprehensive, Marcus said. But Voss has a legal team that will argue the Geneva account is a discretionary blind trust with no documented connection to the Gulf South transactions. To guarantee criminal prosecution and full asset recovery, we need Marsh to testify. We need him to give us the communications, the meeting records, and the transfer authorizations directly from Voss. Franklin thinks Voss will protect him, Victoria said. Then we need to show him what Voss did this morning. Marcus opened his laptop and turned it toward her. On the screen was a press statement issued by Voss Maritime Group at 9:47 a.m., 6 hours after Franklin Marsh's arrest. It was 3 paragraphs of crisp, carefully lawyered corporate prose expressing profound concern about the apparent financial irregularities at Hartwell Atlantic, characterizing the situation as the apparent result of internal misconduct by a senior financial officer acting without the knowledge or authorization of any external party, and offering full cooperation with federal authorities. Victoria read it once. He's positioning Franklin as a lone actor, she said. The Geneva account becomes a blind trust with no traceable Voss authorization. The Cayman transfers become payments that Marsh routed to himself using forged Voss entity credentials. Voss walks away. Marsh takes every count. Victoria reached for her coat. "Get your jacket, Mr. Webb," she said. "We're going to the MCC. The Metropolitan Correctional Center on Park Row was 11 blocks from One World Trade Center, and approximately 11 light-years from the world Franklin Marsh had occupied for the previous 4 decades. He was in a federal holding unit, in a room with a steel table and institutional fluorescent lighting and a door that locked from the outside. He had retained Sullivan and Cromwell at a cost of $900 an hour and was refusing all communication with federal investigators, operating on the assumption, the confident, reasonable, well-founded assumption, that Edward Voss would deploy his considerable legal and financial resources to protect the man who had served as his instrument. When the door opened and Victoria Hartwell walked in, followed by a man in a Navy cleaning uniform carrying a spiral notebook, Franklin Marsh blinked twice. Then he arranged his expression into something that resembled his old authority. "You have no legal standing to be here, Victoria. My attorney will—" "Read this," Victoria said, and slid the Voss Maritime press statement across the steel table. Marsh read it. The transformation was not gradual. It was immediate and total. The color leaving his face in a single, rapid recession, the careful composure of 40 years dismantling itself in the time it took to reach the second paragraph. "He's classifying you as a rogue actor," Marcus said from the corner of the room. His voice was not unkind. "The Geneva account becomes a blind trust. The Cayman transfers become fraud you committed against Voss Maritime using forged credentials. You don't get a reduced sentence. You get charged with the full $431 million. Federal wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy, money laundering. You're looking at 40 years minimum." Marsh stared at the press release. "Or," Victoria said, placing the cooperation agreement on the table beside it, "you give us everything, the encrypted communications, the meeting records, the transfer authorization chain, every instruction Voss gave you, every dollar he promised you, every conversation from the first contact to this morning. You give us Edward Voss, and I will personally call the U.S. Attorney and recommend the most favorable disposition her office can offer." Boss, Franklin Marsh, who had guided James Hartwell through 2 recessions, who had held Victoria's hand through her first crisis, who had spent 18 months methodically destroying the company of the man who had trusted him most, put his face in his hands. The sound he made was not quite a sob. It was the sound of a very long fall finally reaching the bottom. "Okay," he said into his palms. "Okay, I'll give you everything. Act 4, what we get to keep." Edward Voss was arrested at 6:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, not at his office, not in a boardroom, not in any of the controlled, powerful environments he had spent 67 years carefully constructing around himself as insulation from the consequences of his decisions. He was arrested at Teterboro Airport in Bergen County, New Jersey, 7 steps from the air stairs of his Gulfstream G700, his flight plan filed for Nassau, a city that, by a particular coincidence that the FBI agents on the tarmac found professionally satisfying, shared its name with the jurisdiction where the ghost vendor infrastructure he had funded was first incorporated. He was wearing a gray cashmere overcoat and carrying a single carry-on bag. He said nothing when the agents approached. He was a man who had spent 4 decades paying other people to do his talking, and even in this moment, perhaps especially in this moment, the habit held. He simply looked at the lead agent with the expression of a man calculating odds, found them unfavorable, and allowed himself to be guided toward the waiting vehicle without resistance. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit executed simultaneous search warrants on Voss Maritime Group's offices in Manhattan, Houston, and Miami at the same moment. Teams from the Department of Justice's Asset Forfeiture Unit began the process of identifying and freezing $1.2 billion in Voss-affiliated holdings, real estate, investment accounts, shipping contracts, the Geneva Wealth Management account, and the 17 shell entities that had served as the laundering architecture for the theft from Hartwell Atlantic. Franklin Marsh had testified for 4 days. His testimony was the kind that federal prosecutors described, in the careful understatement of their profession, as comprehensive. He provided encrypted message transcripts spanning 14 months. He provided the account credentials and authorization codes for every layer of the ghost vendor structure. He provided the records of 6 in-person meetings with Edward Voss, 2 at the Knickerbocker Club on 62nd Street, 1 at Voss's compound in Greenwich, 3 at a private members club in Washington, D.C., at which the specific mechanics of the scheme had been designed, refined, and set in motion. He provided the name of the Voss Maritime attorney who had incorporated Gulf South Maritime Supply, LLC, in Tallahassee. He provided the name of the Voss Maritime CFO who had managed the BVY holding structure. He provided the handwritten note, recovered from a locked drawer in his home office in Greenwich, Connecticut, which his own attorney had advised him to surrender, in which Edward Voss had outlined in his precise, old money cursive the projected acquisition cost of Hartwell Atlantic's North Atlantic fleet at a Chapter 11 liquidation auction. The number was $890 million. The company was worth $4.6 billion. The federal indictment ran to 112 counts across 4 defendants: Edward Voss, his CFO, his outside attorney, and a senior auditor at the firm that had signed off on the fraudulent KPMG review, a man who had received $2.3 million in Cayman account transfers for his cooperation and would spend the remainder of his career explaining to a federal judge why that had seemed like a reasonable professional decision. Would say Victoria Hartwell convened the emergency board meeting at 8 a.m. on the Thursday after Voss's arrest. The directors assembled in the same rosewood-tabled boardroom where 9 days earlier they had been preparing to oversee the orderly liquidation of a 60-year-old American institution. They sat in their familiar chairs with the careful, attentive expressions of people who were uncertain whether they were about to be congratulated or fired and were trying to appear comfortable with either outcome. Victoria walked in at 8:01. She was wearing a charcoal acris suit, not the Loro Piana she had worn the morning of the signing, which she had quietly donated to a Dress for Success chapter in the Bronx, unable to look at it without remembering the feeling of the pen in her hand. Her posture was what it had always been: composed, precise, unhurried. But something in her bearing had shifted in the 9 days since the boardroom confrontation. The quality of her stillness was different. It was the stillness of someone who had been to the edge and come back with better information about where the edge actually was. She stood at the head of the table and let the room settle. "The deficit has been eliminated," she said. "The $431 million stolen from Hartwell Atlantic's operational accounts has been identified, legally separated from Voss Maritime's legitimate holdings, and is currently under DOJ asset recovery order. We expect full restitution within 60 days. Our credit facilities at JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America have been reinstated. Our bond rating is under review for upgrade. The fleet is fully operational." She let that land. Voss Maritime Group is under federal receivership. Their North Atlantic terminal contracts, the same contracts Edward Voss spent 20 years trying to acquire from us, are currently available for competitive bid. I have authorized our acquisitions team to prepare a formal offer. We are not restructuring. She looked around the table. "We are expanding." There was a beat of complete silence. Then Thomas Aldridge, the longest-serving board member, a 71-year-old Boston Brahmin who had voted against Victoria's appointment as CEO 15 years ago and had been quietly wrong about her every year since, began to applaud. The rest of the board followed within seconds. Victoria raised her hand. The room went quiet. "There is one more matter," she said. She looked toward the back of the room. Marcus Webb walked forward. He was wearing a charcoal suit, made to measure, from a tailor on Madison Avenue that Victoria had recommended, and whose number she had texted him the morning after the boardroom confrontation with a message that read simply, "You'll need this." Thursday at 9 a.m., VH. He carried a leather briefcase, calfskin, the same style his mother had given him when he passed his CPA exam, because he had described it once and Victoria had apparently filed the detail away. His posture was straight. His eyes were clear. He looked, for the first time in 6 years, like a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. "I would like to formally introduce Hartwell Atlantic's new Chief Risk Officer," Victoria said. "Marcus Webb. His analysis identified and documented this fraud before a single additional dollar was lost and before this company signed away its existence. His compensation, equity participation, and authority within this organization are commensurate with that contribution. His word carries the weight of mine in all matters of financial oversight and risk assessment. If he tells you a number is wrong, you stop what you're doing and you listen to him." She paused. "Are there questions?" There were no questions. The board members, several of whom had been in this building on the morning of the confrontation, and had learned in subsequent days exactly who the man in the Navy cleaning uniform had been and what he had done, rose from their chairs and shook Marcus Webb's hand with the particular, slightly overcorrected warmth of people who were aware they were making up for something. Marcus accepted each handshake with the quiet, steady courtesy of a man who had decided that grace was more useful than scorekeeping. But his mind, as Victoria had correctly anticipated it would be, was already elsewhere. Clara Webb turned 11 years old on a Saturday in October. She had requested with the specific and non-negotiable certainty that characterized her approach to most things. A birthday at the American Museum of Natural History on Central Park West. Not the gift shop. Not the cafe. She wanted the Hall of Saurischian dinosaurs, specifically the Tyrannosaurus Rex mount on the 4th floor. And she wanted to explain it to everyone present in sufficient detail that they would leave knowing something they hadn't known before. Marcus had agreed immediately. Diane had laughed for the first time in what felt like a very long time. They were standing in front of the T-Rex mount, all 40 feet of it, suspended in its predatory lurch above the 4th floor gallery, when Clara finished her explanation of the current paleontological consensus on warm-bloodedness in large theropods, and turned to find Victoria Hartwell crouched at her eye level, genuinely absorbed. "So they weren't cold-blooded," Victoria said, "like we used to think." "No," Clara said, with the patient firmness of someone correcting a misconception for perhaps the 400th time. That was wrong. Scientists figured out the right answer. It just took a while because they were looking at the wrong evidence. Victoria glanced up at Marcus over Clara's head. He smiled. He couldn't help it. "That happens sometimes," Victoria said, looking back at Clara. "Looking at the wrong evidence." "Yeah," Clara said. "But when you find the right number, everything makes sense." She turned back to the dinosaur with the serene, unhurried confidence of someone who had already moved on to the next thing she wanted to understand, and Marcus watched her. This fierce, funny, stubborn, magnificent child who had survived something unsurvivable and come out the other side more herself than ever, and felt the particular, overwhelming quality of gratitude that has no adequate language. "She's remarkable," Victoria said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "She is," Marcus said. "She gets it from her mother." Diane, who was across the gallery, photographing the Apatosaurus mount, with the slightly chaotic enthusiasm of someone who had not expected to find natural history this engaging, looked over at that moment and caught Marcus's eye. She raised her eyebrows in a question. "You okay?" He nodded. "More than okay." Later, after the cake, after Clara had made everyone in the party confirm they understood the difference between Brontosaurus and Brachiosaurus, after Diane had driven Clara back to Flatbush in the early evening while Marcus lingered in the museum lobby with Victoria, they stood on the steps of the museum in the October dark, the Central Park tree line copper and amber across the street, the city making its particular Saturday evening sound around them. "Are you happy?" Victoria asked. It was not a casual question. She did not ask casual questions. Marcus thought about it honestly, the way she deserved, the way the question deserved. He thought about the brownstone he had lost, and the Flatbush apartment he had lived in, and the overnight shifts and the debt, and the specific grinding endurance of 6 years of keeping his daughter alive on the margin. He thought about the morning he had stood in the corner of a boardroom with a squeaky-wheeled cart and a notebook with a Triceratops sticker and made the most consequential decision of his life on the basis of nothing more sophisticated than the conviction that the truth mattered. He thought about Clara's face in the 4th floor gallery, serious and lit up and completely, entirely alive. "Yes," he said, "I am." Victoria looked out at Central Park for a moment. "My grandfather used to say that the only things worth building are the things worth protecting," she said. He meant ships. I think he meant more than that. She turned to him. "Thank you, Marcus, for what you did in that room, for what you saw. You listened," he said. "That's not nothing." She smiled, a real one, without the precise calibrated quality of the smiles she deployed in boardrooms. "No, it's not." She flagged a cab heading downtown. Marcus stood on the museum steps and watched the taillights disappear into the park traffic, and thought about the particular, unpredictable mathematics of a life. The way it could take everything, and take it without warning, and then one morning at 6:18 a.m. present you with a single column of numbers and ask you, without ceremony, who you still were. He pulled his phone from his pocket and texted Clara, "What's the largest theropod ever discovered?" The reply came in 45 seconds. "Spinosaurus." "Obviously, Dad." "Pay attention." Marcus Webb laughed. Alone on the steps of the American Museum of Natural History in the October dark, in the city that had taken everything from him and given it back in a form he hadn't expected and couldn't have designed, and the sound of it rose up into the amber-lit night and disappeared into the noise of 10 million people living their lives. He put his phone away. He had a healthy daughter and a city full of numbers, and a corner office on the 53rd floor of One World Trade Center where tomorrow morning he would sit down at a forensic workstation and begin looking with the patient, precise attention of a man who understood exactly what was at stake for the next thing that didn't belong. Sometimes the universe rolls the dice and takes the table, but sometimes, if you keep your eyes open, if you keep reading the numbers even when you are supposed to be invisible, if you say, "Wait," when everything in the room is telling you to be quiet, sometimes you find the one thing everyone else missed. And sometimes that is enough to change everything. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever felt invisible in a room that needed what you had, hit like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We tell one story a week. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss one. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Marcus's shoes?